And good to see everybody. I'll share screen in just a minute and pop up the slides that I know Tina sent out earlier and walk through. But 90 minutes is a lot longer than I can sit still without engagement. So please, any point, feel free to raise questions or comment and post something in the chat, raise the hand. If I don't see it or notice it, because I'm just blowing and going, unmute and say something. So I'd like to make it as interactive as we can. Let me go to the slides. All right. So it may look like I'm at the office, but as you could probably tell, since I seem to be disappearing into the background, I'm not really sitting on my desk or leaning against it, but that's a virtual background. I'm teaching this semester my course in the hybrid format where, half are there on Monday, Wednesday, and the other half on Tuesday, Thursday, and we're simul Zooming to everybody else. And we've had 2 positives out of my students last week, so we moved to online only this week. So I'm also working from home for this week, just to be doubly cautious. And one of my friends said, "Gosh, what a nerd! Your virtual background picture is from your office." But oh well, it looks official. So part of my, I guess now near half a lifetime passion for service as well as opportunities for research have been in the criminal justice mental health area, and that's obviously the focus today. And I want to tell you just a little bit about my background and the reason for my interest in this area. My younger brother, who passed away a few years ago, when he was a senior in college, he had his first psychiatric break. He was a good student. He was a geology student down at Sul Ross, and that's when he was really stricken with schizophrenia. Of course, he didn't know it at the time. My family didn't know it at the time, other than probably the actions of a scared and caring roommate may have saved his life. He called my parents, said, "I'm really worried about Greg. He's talking about suicide." And my parents went down to Alpine. They were in San Angelo. Dad had been a coach and taught at Angelo State. Mom was a public school teacher, and they brought him back, and that began really an odyssey for him of about 7 years in and out of hospitals, doing better, then stopping taking meds, not doing well, and going through a legal process as well. Unfortunately for Greg, the last time he'd been hospitalized, one of the newer generations of medications had come along, and for him it was the right medication. He stuck with it the last 25 years of his life. He was never hospitalized again for mental health reasons, and it permitted him to lead an improved life. He had part-time jobs and supported housing. He received outpatient services from the MHMR there in San Angelo. Fortunately, never had any encounter with the criminal justice system, but in that way, he was somewhat unusual in that we see today a significant number of individuals with mental illness getting caught up in the criminal justice system. Well, somebody having a person with mental illness in the family, like some of you know, can impact and does impact the whole family. My parents, like me, we didn't know anything really about mental illness. My dad probably knew more. He had been a coach and then went back to get his doctorate, and his dissertation was working not with persons with mental illness, but youth with what today we call intellectual disabilities. Back then was described as mental retardation. And had done his research on adaptive physical education for kids with IDD. And so when he got the teaching gig at Angelo State, he ended up being asked and serving a 2-year term on the board for the mental health center there, MHMR of Concho Valley. And so he had some awareness of mental illness because the center provided those services, but not a great deal. But he knew something was amiss. Obviously, with my brother, didn't know whether it was drugs or mental health related issues. And at least he was better armed than others. I still recall them telling me, I was off as a young lawyer serving time with the Air Force at the Pentagon, so I wasn't at home anymore. But I remember them telling me that they'd gone and talked to their pastor, a well-meaning Methodist pastor, but he didn't know much about mental illness either, and suggested, well, tough love, just cut him off, and he'll straighten up. Well, that's not good. And of course, later from history, we know that John Hinckley's parents got the same advice from the doc who was seeing John Hinckley, and so they did, and not to their discredit, but Hinckley then flies first to New Haven and then on to Washington, and sadly into the pages of history in that regard. So clearly the wrong message, and again, a lack of general awareness about matters involving mental illness. Well, I think today there's a much broader level of awareness and knowledge, but still we've got a ways to go. Well, now tying into criminal justice issues. So I came back from my time at the Air Force, was practicing law in Austin a couple years, got the chance to come teach at Texas Tech, moved here in 88, now more than half a life ago. And my mom she stopped school teaching at 58 and became a full-time advocate, and ended up being president of the State Alliance for Mental Illness, NAMI, Texas, it's called now, and then later president of NAMI. And somewhere late 80s, early 90s, we were seeing a lot more persons with mental illness getting caught up in the criminal justice system. And she reached out to me and said, are there any good resources, any good books or guides in the area? And I said, well, no, unfortunately not. There's a pretty good guide by a prof at HealthLaw on civil commitments in the mental health code, but really nothing on criminal law. And she said, well, aren't you supposed to write as part of your job? Why don't you do it? And hence, I got involved in doing a number of different projects and publications tied to criminal justice and persons with mental illness. And people ask me, well, how did you get started, or why this area? And I said, because my mother told me to. Yeah, good a reason as any, I guess. And it was nice. I had full support from the dean's office. I'd had tenure by then. This wasn't traditional legal scholarship, but these are the kinds of publications I'm more proud of because they get used by practicing lawyers and judges and citizens just trying to work their way through some of these complicated provisions. So with that as background and kind of why I'm interested, let me go on into what I want to address today. I want to spend a little time on civil interventions, turn to criminal law topics generally, and then describe some recent legislative and judicial reform efforts and some things we can look towards the next legislative session for possible action. The percentages are huge, and persons with mental illness are are really disproportionately represented within not just Texas, but our nation's jails and prisons. So roughly 5% of the population has a serious mental illness, yet 3 times that or more end up within parts of the jail population. And within that segment, even more with co-occurring substance abuse disorders. So significant challenges and problems in that area. Well, does that mean, gosh, there must be a lot of folks with mental illness who are just really bad people committing all sorts of crimes? By and large, the vast majority of people with mental illness or intellectual disabilities who get caught up in the criminal justice system typically are charged and often guilty of very minor offenses: simple theft, vagrancy, loitering, drug offenses, not serious major crimes. Now, some can and do, and those cases tend to get headlines, but the vast majority are often caught up in the criminal justice system because we've not done a good job as a society with identifying and treating persons with mental illness in the community on the civil side. So for purposes of the law, what are we talking about with respect to the definitions? Who are we defining as being persons with mental illness? The Health and Safety Code, sometimes called the Mental Health Code in the civil law, defines mental illness pretty broadly. And notice here in this definition, it doesn't include any specific diagnosis. Instead, it's looking more at impact, functioning. So illness, disease, or condition substantially impairs a person's thoughts, perception of reality, emotional process, judgment, grossly impairs behavior. It's demonstrated by recent disturbed behavior. It also carves out epilepsy, dementia, substance abuse, or intellectual disability. So for purposes of a civil commitment, a mental health commitment, those aren't covered by the statute. Now, there's a separate statute with respect to commitments for services for persons with intellectual disabilities. There's yet another statute on substance abuse. And we don't have much in the way of legal resources for persons with Alzheimer's, dementia, epilepsy. It's just not a direction that law has gone, although many times you see with particularly elderly with dementia, there may well be a guardianship that's been created. So a family member or friend might get appointed as a guardian for that person. Well, in a separate statute in the insurance code, there's a further definition that goes beyond just this broad mental illness definition, but does identify diagnoses and describes serious mental illness as illnesses including bipolar disorder, childhood or adolescent depression, major depressive disorder, schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia, serious brain diseases. And I should pause there. As you likely know, these are neurobiological illnesses. Just like other organs of the body, the brain too can become ill. It's not a matter of willpower, as that pastor told my parents. I think if you asked many people with these diseases, would you like to be better? The answer would be a resounding yes. But it takes, for the most individuals, appropriate medications to help balance out the brain chemistry, as well as other supports for dealing with serious illnesses. These are the kinds of illness I'm talking about in this case. I mean, there are other mental health related issues that are, the DSM-5 is replete with them, which could result from trauma, child abuse, other abusive relationships that are also mental health conditions, but for purposes of legal definitions of mental illness, where a civil commitment can lie, or serious mental illness, which comes into play, not surprisingly. You see here the reference to the insurance code well, I did not want to do that, with the insurance code with purposes of certain protections in insurance law and insurance statute. When my mother was president of the NAMI Texas, I helped her with drafting some legislation that we got passed, and then Governor Bush signed into law, that created parity in Texas for treatments for these mental illnesses on a par with illnesses affecting any other parts of the body. Later, a federal law was enacted on the same sorts of issues, the Domenici-Wellstone Act, that also created parity in insurance for these diagnoses, these illnesses. And then that was later incorporated into part of the Affordable Care Act. And so significant in terms of the ability to have private insurance, as well as some of the issues we're hearing talked about even as we speak about pre-existing conditions and coverage for purposes of insurance. So I'd be remiss not to also identify intellectual disabilities. Typically with intellectual disabilities, we're talking about significant impairment to mental functioning. It's not an illness, but functioning with an onset prior to the person reaching the age of 18 that limits substantial life activities. Typically, persons with intellectual disabilities comprise roughly 3% of the population, but you see here too, like a 3-to-1 ratio looking at those who get caught up in the criminal justice system. I was talking yesterday at an event with one of the social workers who works with the Lubbock Public Defender's Office, and she talked about one of the clients on their roles they've worked with for some time, where he ended up with a 2-year sentence for stealing a Twinkie. And to me, it's just appalling. That's just not a good use of resources, and nor is it a way to help this person become a contributing member within society. So why do we need court-ordered mental health services? Obviously, voluntary treatment is preferred at any point for any kind of illness. But particularly when we're talking about these serious mental illnesses, it's often not sought. Many times the reason for that, a high percentage of individuals with serious mental illness, particularly schizophrenia and some of the other illnesses like bipolar and schizoaffective disorder, persons with those illnesses also have a symptom that I don't pronounce well, but anosognosia. It's a medical condition in which the person is just unaware of the mental illness or unable to perceive the condition accurately. They may well know they have a mental illness, but they think they're doing fine. I still remember a friend I had a number of years ago who I met through volunteer work with NAMI. He was a successful businessman in San Antonio, has bipolar disorder. And I remember him telling me one time, he said, you know, when I'm off my meds and not doing well, I have no idea. And particularly in the manic stage, I'm feeling pretty good. But my wife knows, and she reminds me, you need to take your meds. And I think it's part of this anosognosia. I remember with my brother, when he wasn't doing well.
And then do it later when this is over, okay?
What's this?
I'm sorry, was there a question?
I'm sorry, there was a new member. I didn't mute her microphone fast.
Oh, okay, very good. Very good. Yeah, thank you. So with, I know with my brother, when he was in decline, not doing well, not on his meds, he would not recognize, let's just give an example. He was a smoker too, and he would say things that just to us didn't make any sense. I've been smoking with my right hand, but you know, right hand's the hand of God. If I smoke with my left hand, I'll be fine. Well, you can't argue logically with, well, you can, but it doesn't get you anywhere. But we could tell that he wasn't aware or perceiving what was happening with that illness. I remember going to a high school football game with him when I was home for holiday one year, and rather than watch the game, he was perceiving what was going on, but perceiving like the spin on the ball. Well, look at the rotation of the ball, and talking about things that just didn't fit. There wasn't an awareness of this condition. And so you might say, hey, don't you want to go see the doc and just have a checkup, have them take a look and see maybe there needs to be an adjustment in medication. And the response often is, I'm fine. I don't need that help. There's not that recognition. And so that leaves then the possibility of, well, what do we know about the illnesses? You know, what more should we know? What services are there? And then what are some of the legal steps, the legal options that are out there? And so let me just pose some hypothetical scenarios, which, you know, in law kind of like to do. Let's suppose we have Ann, and Ann's at a local convenience store, and she's not doing very well. She's disheveled, exhibiting poor hygiene, and she's kind of stalking through the convenience store, muttering to herself in a nonsensical fashion, coming up to other patrons at the store and the clerk working behind the counter, saying things that they don't understand, actually frightening some of the individuals there. Now, what do you anticipate is the likely response of this, 23-year-old clerk who's working alone at the convenience store, being presented with Ann and how Ann is acting? You know, anywhere in the country, that clerk probably first thought is going to be to call the police. Not a surprise. Law enforcement, they're going to be the first responder in this type of scenario. And so the police come out, and here's where, you know, some of the discussions and all since the killing of George Floyd and some of the other terrible incidents, you see this discussion of defund police and the like. I'm not sure that, to me, is the best characterization. Instead, I think a lot of the recommendations or focus has been on, well, where are resources going? Are these calls to go deal with Ann solely a police matter, or do we want to have what a number of communities have, basically a joint response team, a mental health crisis response team or teams, where an officer as well as a trained mental health person or social worker go out together and make these calls? And we're seeing that in more communities. Denver's just adopted this program. Houston and San Antonio have done a great job in this regard, but of course those are huge places, and Houston has 9 or 10 units. Well, that's great, but then you think about how many millions of people and millions of, not millions, many thousands of square miles are involved in those areas, and 9 or 10 aren't necessarily enough. But that kind of programs there. So the officer comes out, and the officer has some options at that time. Well, let me change it a little bit. Suppose that prior to police being called, with Ann too here, rather than just kind of alarming people there in the store, Ann grabs some cookies and a 6-pack and rushes out the door and says something about Satan's in the parking lot and is hungry and thirsty. So now we have more than just perhaps trespassing, being asked to leave. We've got theft. Or to change it up a little bit, the clerk sees and grabs the 6-pack and the cookies and stands at the door and tries to block Ann from running out the door with these goods, and pushes past, and the clerk falls down and bumps her head or bumps his head. So now we might have an assaultive offense. Or I can keep going. Instead of a 22 or 23-year-old clerk, the clerk is 66 and gets pushed down. Uh-oh, now we might have felony assault on the elderly. Or the police show up and Ann's scared and Ann starts to run away. Oh, now we've got evading arrest. Or Ann jumps in a car and drives away. Now we've got felony evading arrest. So very quickly, you see where in a situation in all of those where really what's going on here is probably something related to Ann's mental health or mental illness. Yet at one level, there's probable cause to believe crimes have been committed. And then we can take one more. Ann pulls out a 12-inch Bowie knife and waves it around. Well, there we know where Ann's going. And you've, although there may be mental health related issues, we've got a threat to others at that point. So in thinking these through, the traditional law enforcement response in all those situations, from the simplest nonviolent type scenario, the loitering, the trespassing, to simple theft, to possibly an assaultive offense, to something more, the traditional law enforcement approach was either a stern talking to Ann, or in most cases, taking them to jail with an attitude of, well, no, we'll take them to jail and let the jail sort it out there. And then Ann gets turned over to the criminal justice system. Well, that's not the way under the law it has to be, and we're seeing shifts. There's an opportunity for one path, and I'm calling it path one, that's a civil approach as opposed to making this a criminal justice matter. The law in Texas and most states is going to permit at this point the law enforcement officer to exercise discretion. The officer has the ability to say, hey, this is a mental health matter. Yes, I could arrest Ann, but I think what Ann really needs is a mental health evaluation. And so by law, the statutes will permit in that scenario, the officer to be able to, in effect, apprehend Ann if she doesn't go voluntarily and transport her for what's called emergency detention, a mental health evaluation. And so under our health and safety code, under the emergency detention provisions, there's two paths to possible emergency detention mental health screening. One is a scenario just like I described. A peace officer, based on probable cause to believe that Ann has mental illness and poses a danger to self or others, or is deteriorating in condition to a point where she'd be viewed to be a danger to self or others, the officer can, in effect, apprehend her and transport her to the nearest facility designated by the local mental health authority for an assessment. And if the officer does that, what then is supposed to take place under the law is Ann has to be seen by an MD within 12 hours. Now, Ann's probably going to be seen well before that and by a non-MD mental health assessor, but she has to be seen by an MD to see if she meets criteria to be held any longer at that point. I'm going to pull the chat down because something popped up. Rachel's asked, do officers have the training to make the decision if they're needing an assessment? Wonderful question. The traditional answer to that was no, they didn't. we've seen a significant change in that regard over the last really decade. Starting 10, 12 years ago, there became a bigger push, maybe even 15 years ago, a bigger push for law enforcement to be able to have what's called mental health deputy training. And Sheriff Rowe was one of the deputies at the time, our former sheriff, David Gonzalez. They went through that 40-hour course. Sheriff Rose had most of his deputies go through that 40-hour course. It's a curriculum that's been written and approved for their T-close credits. They have to have so many continuing ed hours, like many of us in our professions. And so that was an early type of training. Now there's additional requirements for all officers to have what's called CIT, crisis intervention training. And it's often offered early as part of rookie school and others. They're supposed to be branching out. So we're seeing a lot of the newer officers who've had the training, and then some more senior officers who've elected to. Those departments that have really bought into this in a big way, there have been great changes. I know Houston was one of the first in Texas, San Antonio, where each of them trained more than 5,000 beat officers, patrol officers in this crisis intervention training. And the program really was first initiated by the folks in Memphis, and sometimes it's called the Memphis model. And I was really excited for our mental health law symposium we did at the law school 2 Novembers ago. In November 2018, we were able to bring Sam Cochran in from Memphis, and he's sort of the godfather of this type of training. And they go about it in terms of not just training officers, but having a community approach. So they'll involve other city and county leaders, family members, other citizens to try and approach it jointly. Miami had significant issues with persons with mental illness and officers being hurt in exchanges where officers hadn't had those training. They've implemented mandatory training, and they've reduced the incidence of these kinds of bad outcomes and bad events for encounters between police and persons in acute mental health crises significantly, as well as had significant diversion of individuals into these other programs. Houston, similarly, as I described, has done a great job of probably 15, 20 years ago, they built a mental health crisis center that's operated by the Public Mental Health Authority there, which is a drop-off place for officers where they can take the individual. They're seeing, I talked last week on the phone with Major Mike Lee, who's with the sheriff's office there, and who I've gotten to know through this Judicial Mental Health Commission. He said it's almost worked too well, and that their officers have bought into it in a big way. And the psychiatric drop-off center there in Houston is almost always full because the officers are TAE folks. So they're having challenges now with spillover to some of the ERs, and it's mixed in terms of how well the response is there. So it's a great question. One of the keys to having better results in this area is to have well-trained local officers. In this regard too, is having, I guess, facilities in place where these sorts of assessments can be done efficiently. And the best ones have an approach where they try and have the individual there, and so the officer can be back out on the streets in 30 minutes to an hour, no more. And the officer hasn't having to wait around for some long period of time, because we want our officers back out doing what they're supposed to be doing. Now, thinking about the statutory coverage and the legal provisions, that's again part of it. Part of it is where the resources in Lubbock, if an officer makes this determination, there are 3 places that at least have been designated as places to go. The Covenant, UMC, or Sunrise Canyon in East Lubbock, which is operated by Star Care, the community mental health center. And I should disclose I'm on that board and have been for many years. And Lubbock is one of only 2 places in the state that has a community-based public psychiatric inpatient facility operated by the local mental health authority. And so we're fortunate to have Sunrise Canyon as a 30-bed community facility so that we don't depend as much in Lubbock on state hospital beds, the nearest one being Big Spring, because we've had our 30-bed facility for a number of years there in the Canyon area in East Lubbock. One of the tough things with COVID is for patient safety. There's actually 15 patient rooms that had been 2 patients per room, but with COVID, you just can't do that. So now the census is capped at 15 and 1 patient per room. So that's been a challenge as well. So that's an entree. The officer making a decision to take Ann for an emergency detention evaluation at one of these facilities. Another alternative, say that police hadn't been called, or say this wasn't at a public venue, but Ann was at home and her family's getting concerned and getting worried. There's another alternative under the law, rather than calling the police, is that in every county in Texas, any adult can go to the courthouse, to the county judge, and file what's called an application for court-ordered mental health services. And a judge then can sign a mental health warrant. Now, they said no warrant for arrest, but it's, as the name suggests, it's a warrant for mental health services. And the judge makes the same kind of call. Based on the documents that are presented, the judge would make a determination, gosh, I think there's probable cause here that Ann needs to be seen by a doctor, and I'm going to sign this. And then that allows one of the, in Lubbock, it'd be one of Sheriff Rowe's trained deputies to go out and in effect serve the warrant to transport Ann to one of the designated facilities. Typically here it would be Sunrise for Ann to be evaluated. Once there, under either path, an officer exercising the officer's discretion or a judge signing an emergency detention warrant, again, it's a cap of 12 hours within which time an MD has to see Ann. Now, if the MD believes that Ann is in need of continued services, at that point, Ann could be held there under Texas law without other legal involvement for up to 72 hours. And I'll add that it's 72 hours, but with an asterisk. If the end of the 72 hours is a weekend, or like this week where we had a 3-day holiday, it's really more. The 72-hour period somebody's not going to be released on Saturday or Sunday because you can't have a further court process to necessarily hold Ann if there's cause to do so. And so that would roll over to the following Monday, or this past week because of Monday's holiday, to roll over to the Tuesday. Well, many times persons with mental illness, just that short window, particularly as is often the case, this might not be Ann's first time to have an encounter with in Lubbock, Star Care or one of the other mental health authorities, is to get Ann back on meds, to get restabilized. And many times the person will respond well to meds, or at least after a day or two volunteer then to stay. And so you wouldn't have any further court process. If there's still a lack of interest in volunteering or ability to volunteer, and there's a decision then that, wait, she's still in need of services, there are further steps where we go back and have court involvement. There's what's called an order of protective custody, leading up even to the possibility of a civil commitment hearing where Ann could be civilly committed inpatient or outpatient, initially for typically a 45-day period, although the court could allow that to go as long as 90 days. Now, we don't have a lot of those in Lubbock County in particular because of Sunrise Canyon being here, one, and two, today the civil commitments, largely this is triage. The average length of stay tends to be 10 to 12 days. And so persons are doing better, no longer meet commitment criteria, and are discharged to outpatient services at that point. Again, on the civil side, certainly far less expensive than if path 2 is taken with respect to going into criminal justice. Linda's asked, is Sunrise for Lubbock citizens only or for anyone from the surrounding area? Star Care serves 5 counties, and I'll show you a map here in just a little bit that identifies those 5 counties. So citizens from any of those 5 counties are covered in the catchment area for Sunrise Canyon. But if there's somebody here in Lubbock who's not a Lubbock citizen, think a Texas Tech student from somewhere else who's having a psychiatric crisis and needs to be hospitalized at Sunrise Canyon. Yes, of course, they can be hospitalized there, and any kind of commitment hearing might be held too. There are some mechanisms where Lubbock County might be able to bill the county of residence where the person's from for the costs of the hearing. But as far as being able to treat individuals, it's broader. It's not just Lubbock citizens. So again, Star Care is the entity. Some of you have been around a while may remember at one time its name was Lubbock Regional MHMR Center. Several years ago, the law changed to eliminate the antiquated term mental retardation from everywhere it was under federal or state law. And so most of the mental health authority centers around the state renamed because the R part, the MR part is no longer something that's appropriate. So Star Care Specialty Health Systems, the name, they operate Sunrise, among other things. Here's that map I was mentioning. So there's 39 public mental health authorities, community centers around the state that provide services largely for the indigent population, persons with serious mental illness, and intellectual disabilities. So for our area, see it's Lubbock, Crosby, Lynn, Hockley, Cochrane. No, I can't see. It's tiny. Cochrane, I think. Yeah. And so that's the primary catchment area and service area then. Now, Star Care also has some grants for some different projects that actually include many counties and broader. And we still have to take individuals to other hospitals if Sunrise is full, for one. And typically that might be buying psychiatric bed days at a private facility like Rivercrest in San Angelo. There are also no beds in Lubbock for persons with serious mental illness who are youth, children or youth. And so that's an area where Star Care, Covenant, UMC, City of Lubbock, County of Lubbock are all working together. And I think you're going to see a combined effort over the next year or two to try and expand the ability to provide such services more broadly in the community. We need more kids' beds. You hate for kids to be hospitalized, but sometimes that need is there as well. So it just gives you a snapshot of the various regions. The state that operates several state hospitals too, the nearest one, of course, as I mentioned, being Big Spring in Howard County. Trying to figure out my map down here. And there's a great need for additional public mental health beds as well. And it's more because we've seen a great growth on the criminal justice side. So let me shift gears to that. Let's suppose the officer takes Ann to jail. Well, that then begins a different process. Some of the changes that we've seen in recent years, changes for the better, have been improvements in the law with respect to mental health screenings at the jail, possible diversion opportunities, trying to divert, particularly if it's a nonviolent offense, diverting Ann out of criminal justice into the civil side. Lots and lots of issues relating to whether the person's competent to stand trial or not. And then in a very small sliver of cases, the insanity defense can come about. Unfortunately, it gets the headlines. It comes up with sometimes where you've got a tragic case, some serious case of often homicide cases. Insanity cases, insanity defenses are raised in less than 1% of all criminal cases. They're successful maybe a fourth of the time. And by successful, I guess I should put a caveat on that. Many times they're only successful when the prosecutor agrees. And it's sometimes what I call a laydown case. They don't contest it. Oh yeah, we know this person's really ill and really needs to spend a long time, if not the rest of the life, in the hospital system and not in prison. But some are contested, and obviously there's high profile cases. The state tends to win most of those, not all, but the test is very, very narrow. Far more people, the huge number of people relate to people like Ann, nonviolent offenses, mentally ill, getting caught up in the criminal justice system, and they might not be competent to stand trial. So some of the things we've seen in terms of challenges is, for all practical purposes, the criminal justice system is operating a second public mental health system. Anybody know what the largest public mental health facility is in Texas? The Harris County Jail. Number 2 is the Dallas County Jail. Harris County Jail actually employs something like 28 psychiatrists full time. I mean, one, the Harris County Jail is huge, but because we've largely criminalized so much of mental illness, many people are getting caught up in the criminal justice system. For some, it's the first time they've ever been diagnosed. For others, they're released, there's not a lot of dollars for public community services, and you get into this revolving door where somebody's in and out, in and out, in and out. So these are some of the public policy, public health challenges that we face in Texas, and not just in Texas. I mean, certainly you read similar stories with respect to Cook County Jail in Chicago, challenges in New York, other places in trying to deal with this. Well, how did this come about? Where are we in all this? And some of it goes back even to the 60s and 70s, where we had largely what some call deinstitutionalization, others have called trans-institutionalizations. a lot of the state mental hospitals, not just in Texas, but elsewhere, were pretty bad places. And there wasn't a lot of patient-centered care and appropriate services. Some were described as warehouses. And so a number of lawsuits were brought around the country, including in Texas. In fact, the Texas State hospital system was under federal court oversight for over 2 decades. They weren't good places. And so they're much better today. Federal lawsuit resulted in more dollars being spent, but at the same time, the patient population was reduced considerably. Well, that's good. We don't want to have long-term patients. Problem is, the goal was community mental health centers were supposed to pick up the slack and provide those services. But what we've seen over time is the dollars didn't follow the patients. So thinking in terms of the patient populations who were in the state hospitals in the 60s and 70s, the dollars didn't necessarily follow into community-based services for those individuals. And then what's happened to the population? Obviously, Texas, the population has grown tremendously. And if you think of a constant likelihood that you have about 5% of the population with serious mental illness, schizophrenia is about 1%, bipolar a little larger, major depression, is that you have more and more people in need of the services, and the services haven't kept up. Texas for years and years was one of the worst, still is, in terms of per capita spending on persons with serious mental illness. Remember, we used to have a joke, thank God for Mississippi, because they tended to be maybe the only state that was a little worse. Well, we've gone up some, we're a little better, but we're still probably in the 40s in terms of per capita spending. So that's been a challenge. That's gotten the legislature's attention, and it's interesting in the sort of course, I'm kind of a policy wonk, and before I took the teaching job at Tech, I'd worked for a firm in Austin that did lobbying. So I love the stuff that at the legislature, I don't necessarily like a lot of the results, but the process is fascinating. And one of the big changes probably in the last 10 years has been combined efforts between mental health providers, docs, and law enforcement going together to the legislature to identify some of these issues. I mean, the sheriffs don't want people with serious mental illness in the jail either if they don't need to be there, if they've committed some minor offense. And so a lot of these efforts at reforms and changes are coming through some shared attitude and system. So we've seen some good efforts in the last couple of years. And in the last 2 legislative sessions, in 2017 and 2019, there was a real focus in some legislation in 2017 that was then fine-tuned in 2019, relating to simple things such as better and more timely screening for mental illness and IDD when somebody gets to the jail, when they're arrested. And so now under the law, the sheriff has to provide a notice to a magistrate. And in Texas, the magistrate could go all the way up to Supreme Court judge, but we're usually talking about a JP or a part-time judge who's appointed to handle arraignments and the like. The sheriff has to act within 12 hours to give notice to that magistrate within 12 hours of arrest that, in my case, Anne is a person with mental illness, and whether or not some further steps need to be taken. And if Anne's been there before, there's likely going to be some kind of report on record that already identifies Anne as a person with mental illness. But if not, the magistrate is going to get this notice, and the magistrate's going to order, usually the local mental health authority, here StarCare, to do, in effect, a quick interview with the person. It's not any kind of full-blown assessment or full-blown evaluation. It's a quick review, a quick interview with Ann to identify really just three things. Is Ann a person with mental illness or IDD? Is Ann in need of treatment, and if so, what? And third, if Ann does get charged, should there be a full-blown competency evaluation and proceeding or not? And so that's simple. And that report has to go back and be done and handled in 72 hours. Prior to 2017, this existed, but the sheriff had 72 hours, not 12. And the report could be done in 30 days, not 3 days. And so the goal was to have a quick determination. And then what do you do with that once there is that determination? Well, the hope is you can get Ann to agree to start having services. Unless she refuses, the jail should be providing mental health care. Well, that was another thing that passed in 2017. Something called the Sandra Bland Act was passed. And the Sandra Bland Act, Sandra Bland, of course, was yet another person who was a victim of police neglect and died in custody. This act was passed, and it included within it a number of policing reforms. That part got stripped out. It didn't pass. After George Floyd and others, I've seen that the sponsors who carried the Sandra Bland Act 4 years ago plan to come back and try and reintroduce that in this coming legislative session. But the mental health piece has stayed. And part of what passed was great, but it was aspirational, that every county should make a good faith effort to divert persons with mental illness out of jail and into treatment. Well, sounds good, but it's aspirational. You know, what does that mean? Good faith, try and take steps. There weren't any dollars necessarily behind it. No mandate to do it. Other parts, though, did have mandates. And one of those was the Commission on Jail Standards. In fact, the entity that oversees jails and allows them to keep in business, the Commission on Jail Standards was to add to their regulations rules that local jails have to make available 24/7 healthcare and 24/7 psych care. Now that can be done through telehealth or telepsych, but that rule, it's taken a while for the process to work, but that rule is finally supposed to go into place. I think it went in place August 31st. So jails had to provide reports on how they're meeting that. And so, for example, Star Care has a direct contract with the Lubbock County Jail to provide mental health services in the jail, but they also have a contract to provide telehealth, telepsych services to one of the other rural jails within the 5 counties. TexasTech Health Sciences Center, through Dr. Jumper and some of their programs, they have contracts with a number of other rural counties to be able to provide it. So I think this is huge, that this is access for the services. What we have in terms of a 2021 proposal that we're working on out of the Judicial Commission on Mental Health is to expand that and also identify that the jails have to keep on hand or otherwise make available the appropriate medications. Because you can have a service and a directive to take meds, but if there aren't meds, that doesn't do you much good. Now, I think that could be a fight. Some of the counties are going to talk about how, well, that costs money. And well, yes, but I think there's already a legal obligation to provide that kind of service as is. Another thing that passed in 2017 and the funding was renewed in 2019 was some targeted grant funding. So let me spend just a minute or two talking about that. What this was intended to do is to try and create community partnerships to try and address the greater presence of persons with mental illness getting caught up in the criminal justice system. Another thing that the legislature had passed as part of the substantive laws in 2017, 2019 were some tweaks to our criminal competency proceedings. Now, before getting into the specifics of the grants, I need to take just a moment to talk about competency. As a matter of constitutional law, a person has to be competent to be tried. That was established by the US Supreme Court in the case, excuse me, 1960. Well, what does that mean? It means that a person needs to understand the proceedings that are ongoing against him or her, and needs to be able to communicate and work in a meaningful way with his or her attorney. Otherwise, constitutionally, it's not fair. It's not appropriate to hold such a proceeding if the person can't work with his or her attorney or doesn't know what's going on. Well, if somebody is in acute psychosis and not stabilized with medication and appropriate treatment, often they're not going to be competent to stand trial. Well, what we've seen is increased attention to this issue over the last 15 or so years. Far more people who have been caught up in the criminal justice system aren't getting the services in the community, aren't getting services at the jail, and are found incompetent to stand trial. And then they're ordered to competency restoration services. Yet there aren't enough beds in the inpatient facilities at the state hospitals, and so there are long waiting lists. So somebody might be ordered by a court, found by a court to not be competent because of mental illness, ordered to receive services inpatient, and yet they have to wait 6 or 9 months before they can even get transported to a state hospital for services. Plus, now more than 50% of the beds at the public hospitals are taken up by people on criminal justice commitments. And there aren't enough beds for civil. And so that's compounded the issue. So the legislature has provided more funding and also some statutory changes trying to address this. On the big funding level, a lot of dollars were appropriated to, in effect, build a new Austin State Hospital and build a new San Antonio State Hospital to be able to have a larger census of persons who can receive inpatient services. But not limited to inpatient, the statutes now tell judges you should first look to the possibility, in particular with an and, like in my hypothetical, where it's nonviolent in nature, can competency restoration be done on an outpatient basis? If so, use that. Can you have competency restoration in a jail-based setting? Well, that Lubbock had done that for a while, but then there were threats of lawsuits and that got shut down for a while. The legislature said, no, if you do it this way, we're going to permit it. And so with some of the grant funding, both some under Senate Bill 292, as well as House Bill 13, it created grants to do things like provide for more outpatient competency restoration programs, outpatient civil commitment programs, jail-based competency restoration programs. Lubbock, for one, was able to get a grant for creating a jail-based competency restoration program at the Lubbock County Jail. Now, when the Lubbock County Jail, what I call the new jail, I guess it's not as new anymore, but when it was built, they actually created a wing that was a mental health wing. And so structurally, we were one of the few jails out of the 240 or so county jails in the 254 counties of Texas that was already structured in a way physically to be able to do this. But we've had this now up and running for 2 years, and it's helped reduce the wait times for persons who are arrested in Lubbock because the services could be provided there. StarCare also has a grant for an outpatient competency restoration program. So all of this is great, but let me pause just a moment and let you know that unfortunately, there aren't a lot. There are 13 outpatient competency restoration programs in all of Texas. Many of them have small patient loads. Why? Well, that's all that's been funded by the state, even with these grants. There are 5 jail-based competency restoration programs in all of Texas. Small caseloads, not a lot of funding. So the legislature's done a nice job of, I think, teeing things up for the future. It would be great to have more outpatient programs or even jail-based programs for those who have to stay at the jail. But there hadn't been the dollars yet to provide a lot of the services that are needed. We saw these grants passed in the last couple of sessions to do some, more's necessary. And unfortunately, as you can well imagine, there's not going to be any extra money lying around in 2021 because of the impact of the coronavirus on all of us, but also on public revenues that will be available to be appropriated by the legislature. I mean, it will be fortunate for the mental health authorities like StarCare and other public programs to keep what they have after this coming session, because it'll be a challenge. You know, in the long run, I think it's still money very well worth it, because all of these programs are still cheaper than incarcerating somebody in the jail or at the prison for an extended period. So these are some issues that have come up. I also want to note we've seen a very interesting development, well, interesting to me, but a wonderful development in the last 2, now almost 3 years, the creation between the 2 high courts in Texas. You know, we're one of the few states that doesn't have a single high court, but we've got 2. We've got the Texas Supreme Court over civil matters and the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals over criminal matters. So 18 judges, 9 on each, that handle these different dockets. They came together and had this public hearing in January of 2018, and in the next month created what's called the Judicial Commission on Mental Health to try and get the courts focused on these issues and develop programs and training to try and have the courts better positioned to deal with individuals with mental illness and hopefully to have better outcomes for those persons. And I won't bore you with reading all these things in these slides, but the strategic plan has really focused on encouraging judges to sort of be the if you think of a wheel, being the hub with the spokes around to help encourage collaboration, bring parties together to try and come up with improved processes in the community so individuals don't fall through the cracks, to also increase judicial education and education for prosecutors and defense lawyers. A lot of these laws involving persons with mental illness are very complicated. I'm just giving you a toe in the water today. And so trying to help the courts that are involved in this in a day in, day out basis to have a better understanding of the issues they're dealing with. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Interesting. So a couple of things that I've been involved in, this one on the left side of the screen that, or it's left to me, I don't know if it is to you. The Judicial Commission on Mental Health has put together a bench book. And by bench book, we mean just a guidebook that a judge sitting there in court can follow step by step on what to do in one of these cases where it might be a civil commitment, or it might be a criminal commitment or a competency hearing, and taking the judge right down the path to talk about other community resources. And so I got to help them with that. There are other free resources. Texas Appleseed has done a really kind of straightforward, simple little guidebook for attorneys that's free online. And I got to help with that at one point. Over the years, my late colleague Dan Benson and I did several editions of this guidebook on criminal procedure and the offender with mental illness. And I've continued it with the last couple editions since Dan passed away, which is the guidebook, you know, I told you at the start that my mother told me to do. And it's It's not a heavy legal tome. It's more of a step-by-step. Here's these statutes and our take on what they mean and how they can be used. And the Bar Foundation has funded the books. I don't make any money on it. Every penny goes into publishing free copies that can be given away to judges and prosecutors and lawyers. And we've got it online so that people can access it that way as well. And then this last thing, I just want to mention something I've had a very interesting opportunity to be involved for the last year. There's a group called a Model Code Work Group. And this fellow whose image is there is Judge Steve Leifman. Judge Leifman's from Miami. He's a remarkable advocate for persons with mental illness. He's got a criminal court, and they've done so much in Miami with respect to creating alternatives with regard to diverting individuals with mental illness out of criminal justice. And PBS did a nice documentary back in the fall involving, relating to a lot of the work they've done. You can stream it on the PBS website. I think it's called A Case of Insanity, and he's not talking about insane defense. It's like, why are we doing the same thing over and over again? The very definition of insanity. And so it's very encouraging, some of the programs they've done. We've had him out to the law school a couple of times to speak. And the last time he was here was November 2018. And he said they were going to start this project, and could I help with it? And this group, the Equitas Project, has funded it. And what we're trying to do is come up with a model civil mental health commitment that most of the statutes around the country were written in the 60s or 70s. And they very much focus on, you can't get somebody into treatment unless they're a danger, unless they've demonstrated evidence of dangerousness. Problem with that, though, is for many individuals, they can have far better outcomes if you get the medical mental health attention earlier than that. And so what we're trying to do with this draft model code is provide some legislative language that's more consistent with medical understanding in 2020. Not unlike what you see in a guardianship area. Does this person have the capacity to understand the need for treatment? And if so, to at least open the door for that ability for treatment. So we're not quite at the finish line on that, but I hope we're going to have a product out in the coming year. And I was curious when I got asked to do this, well, what's the Equitas Project? Who are they? And I researched them, and I found something really interesting. The family that created the Equitas Project, this is a passion of theirs. They donated a significant amount of money to create this foundation, but they earned their fortune through Hot Pockets. And so it's the family that invented the Hot Pocket, and apparently it's a product that's $1 billion plus business, and it's generated enough that they've been able to create some charitable foundations in areas they feel passionate about. So I guess I should be buying more Hot Pockets to show my support. So that's a long ramble, and I think that covers where I wanted to go. So let me stop with the slides and just turn back to the group and thank all of you who stuck with me. Let me open it up if there are any questions. Hey, Peggy, go ahead, and y'all can unmute if you need to. You're still muted.
There, am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay, first of all, I would like to commend your mother for her advocacy and for taking a personal situation and making it something for the good of all of us, so I commend your mother. But the other thing that I wanted to ask you about was, you talked about the population as a whole, like the 5% of the population, and then the 17% of the population with mental illness, and then those who are have been incarcerated. I'm wondering how that plays out in terms of male and female, and or if there are any other demographic groups. I mean, if how that plays out across the board, especially in Texas.
Yeah, great question. I don't have the precise numbers with me, but certainly nationwide, the percentage of males in jail and prison across the jail and prison population is much higher than females.
Right.
And we've seen it similarly with mental illness. So I was intentionally using Anne in my hypothetical.
I saw that.
A lot of times,
Yeah.
Anne might not end up in jail where Bob would.
Uh-huh.
And then if Anne or Bob is Black, or in our part of the state, Hispanic, there's even greater likelihood that they'll end up in jail.
Okay.
So those are broader issues as well. And it's interesting too, in terms of services. So a lot of Star Care and the other public mental health authority services across the state, they are to persons who are indigent, but with mental illness, indigency is broader than necessarily just being poor, because you can be insurance poor too. And people who've lost their jobs for whatever reason might not have been able to even get coverage under the Affordable Care Act. They too would be eligible for such services. Although people at Sunrise Canyon, I mean, obviously, if somebody has insurance, Star Care is happy to take that as well.
Yeah.
Same at Covenant with their psych beds. Yeah, Marie.
Yes, I wanted to thank you also, you and your mother. My brother suffers from schizophrenia and he lives in a nursing home. He was lucky enough to get Social Security disability, and they take good care of him in near Lubbock in Littlefield. And I was just wondering, is there, besides NAMI, are there any other groups that advocate for mental health reform? I know there are for justice reform, and is there hope that more meaningful legislation will pass this legislative session?
Yeah, great question. So probably the other principal advocate group besides NAMI is Mental Health America, and so a lot of times they're doing things together too. The Texas Council of Community Centers is also the umbrella group for the public mental health centers. And so kind of like the Texas Association of Counties, Texas Municipal League, that's the umbrella group that tends to advocate for their constituency, like the counties or the cities. The Texas, the community centers group focuses in part on funding for the community centers to provide those services. So they too are advocating, particularly on the public dollar settings. And then law enforcement has been very powerful in terms of advocates. I know that Beth Lawson is the CEO for Star Care, and she and Sheriff Rowe went to Washington and testified together about how community public mental health authorities and law enforcement can work together. And that was right before the COVID shutdown. And so they're involved too. As far as things we're going to see in the next session, I'm most familiar with some that the Texas Judicial Commission on Mental Health is proposing, because I've worked on some of those. One is the one I mentioned about having requirements that the jail have meds, that being one, and have access. So I'm hoping to see that. Another is one that law enforcement has asked for, that a an ER or other designated facility for persons with mental illness, if the officer is taking someone to drop them off, that the officer's duties are at an end when the officer fills out the necessary paperwork and does a handoff and can leave. What we're seeing in a lot of places is that the officer is required to stay there while they do medical screening. You know, that a lot of you might want to screen out, you could have other illnesses like a thyroid issue might also mask or have comparable symptoms to mental health, or if it's just a drug-induced psychosis, you know, so there's got to be some kind of mental health, medical screening before you look at mental health. And so one problem law enforcement has talked about, well, they're making our officers sit there for 3 or 4 hours. So they're just going to take them to jail then and not go to the mental health facility. So that's a bill that's going to be heard. There's some others where we were just fine tuning some legal things. That like it's interesting if somebody is released on bond, they have to swear that they're going to appear, right? You know, you want somebody to come back to court, and so they have to swear they're going to appear. Well, with some of these mental health bonds where they might be bonded out with a treatment condition, the whole reason you do the treatment condition is they might not really be all that competent at the time that you're bonding them out. So we've seen some issues where, you know, somebody says, yes, I swear I'll be there, and then they don't show up and they get arrested for that when they didn't know what they were swearing to at the time. So some things like that we're going to tweak as well. I think the biggest fight, at least for public mental health in this next session, is keeping the services that we have now, because there are going to be cuts to many things. I mean, we've already seen at Tech the first round of cuts at the direction that the governor, the speaker, and the lieutenant governor, you know, directed all state agencies and state universities to come up with a 5% cut, which Tech did over the summer, but just, and we're not even talking about the next biennium. That's to get out of this biennium. Anything? Oh, we have to use the rainy day fund, sure, for budget. Well, I agree with that too. Absolutely. If this isn't a rainy day, I don't know what is. A once in a century pandemic impacting everybody, including state revenues. And I think there's probably going to be that possibility. The other that's I hope for, that's not being talked about a lot, but at least quietly perhaps be talked about, is it possible Texas would finally agree to Medicaid expansion? I think that would be and could be huge in terms of being able to pull down more federal dollars for the indigent, for health care for those who are eligible for Medicaid. And it would expand the number of people, right, who would be eligible for Medicaid. And of course, there have been political reasons why our leadership has not done that. I mean, I understand, I guess, where they're coming from, but when we're talking about significant dollars, I hope they'll look at that seriously this time. Well, Tina, I guess I'll give 3 minutes back to you. Everybody's been so patient.
Well, thank you. Yeah, this has been a very interesting class. You know, I don't know if there are many people out here who don't have a family member that
Right.
mental health in some ways. And before we even started, I was talking to Brian about my husband who works with our college kids here in the mental health. He helps to get them what they need. So it really is something that's touched all generations, and every background, just about everybody, I would think. So a very timely topic. Brian, thank you so much for sharing what you know with us. And we have your contact information. I saw somebody had asked about your book. I don't know, Marie, did you get an answer to that? Okay, so yeah, Marie was wanting to know.
Sure, I can send Tina, I can send you the link. And it's also on my little web bio they have on the law school website.
Okay.
And real quick, I ought to add that last session did see a lot of new dollars for kids mental health services, a big program. And our own Dr. Sarah Wakefield, who is the chair of psychiatry at the Health Sciences Center, she's on their big steering committee for that. And so she's a tremendous asset here in Lubbock and to the state as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Brian, and
Yeah.
we look forward to hearing from you
you.
again, hopefully soon. Thanks everybody for attending.
Well, great. Thank all y'all. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you.